The brain, the center of the nervous system. It is found in all vertebrates and most invertebrates, and is the most complex organ in the body. The brain uses axons to carry signals through action potentials. The largest part of the brain is the cerebral cortex, which plays a role in memory, attention, thought, language, and consciousness. The cerebral cortex develops in the anterior part of the neural plate. The cerebral cortex is connected to the other structures, such as the thalamus. There are three parts of the cerebral cortex: the paleocortex, the archicortex, and the neocortex. The neocortex is the most fascinating of the human brain cortices, the part of the brain that separates the warm-blooded mammals from all other animals. The neocortex, from Greek, meaning new bark, is the outermost layer of the cerebral cortex and is responsible for processes associated with higher functions such as spatial reasoning, language, and communication, as well as conscious thought. The neocortex is found in all mammals and is believed to be derived from structures found in the most ancient of mammalian ancestors, nearly 220 million years ago. It also demonstrates an ever-growing trend among mammals, making up only 15% of the brain in platypi, but over 81% of the brain in humans. The neocortex is divided into four major lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe.
The frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for traits unique to humans, such as complex language and emotional processing, consisting entirely of the neocortex. The prefrontal cortex. In humans, the prefrontal cortex takes up the majority of the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex is crucial for performance of almost all skills requiring intelligence. The prefrontal cortex tends to be larger in primates than in other mammals, and it's larger in humans than in other primates. This is correlated with the high amount of high-level planning done by most members of the species. The orbitofrontal cortex. This area is the anterior and medial part of the prefrontal cortex. The orbitofrontal cortex is essential for risk and reward assessment and for what might be known as moral judgment. The premotor cortex. The job of the premotor cortex is to consciously monitor movement sequences using sensory feedback. After the basal ganglia and prefrontal cortex select a goal, the premotor cortex coordinates the steps to reach that goal. Activity in the premotor cortex helps you learn what to pay attention to while you perform a complicated motor sequence, and what to do when you get stuck at some particular point. Think of the frontal cortex as polarized from the anterior to the posterior. Farthest back, at the central sulcus, are neural wires going almost directly to muscles. In the front of these areas, there are things that organize and sequence movements. The parietal lobe. Parts of the parietal lobe have important functions in language processing. This area of the neocortex is responsible for somatosensation. This cortical region receives inputs from somatosensory relays of the thalamus and represents information about touch, pain, temperature, sense, and limb position. The rest of the parietal lobe, posterior to the postcentral sulcus, is divided into upper and lower parts, called the superior parietal lobe and the inferior parietal lobe. The superior parietal lobe is very important for linguistics. There are two gyri that go around the corners. The supramarginal gyrus around the end of the sylvian fissure, and the angular gyrus around the end of the superior temporal sulcus. The temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is involved in auditory processing and is home to the primary auditory cortex. It is also important for the processing of semantics in both speech and vision. The temporal lobe contains the hippocampus and plays a key role in the formation of long-term memory.
Occipital lobe. The occipital lobes are the center of our visual perception system. They are not particularly vulnerable to injury because of their location at the back of the brain, although any significant trauma to the brain could produce subtle changes to our visual perceptual system, such as visual field defects and scotoma. Damage to one side of the occipital lobe causes homonymous loss of vision with exactly the same field cut in both eyes. Disorders of the occipital lobe can cause visual hallucinations and illusions. Visual hallucinations, visual images with no external stimuli, can be caused by lesions to the occipital region or temporal lobe seizures. Parietal epilepsy. Parietal lobe epilepsy is a relatively rare form of epilepsy, comprising about 5% of all epilepsy, in which seizures arise from parietal lobe of the brain. Parietal lobe epilepsy can start at any age and occurs in both males and females equally. It may be a result of head trauma, birth difficulties, stroke, or tumor, though the cause is unknown in 20% of patients. One possibility is vertigo. Patients with parietal seizures may experience a sensation of movement or spinning of the environment or of their body within the environment, or visual illusions and hallucinations. Patients with visual illusions report a distortion of visual perception. Objects seem too close, too far, too large, too small, slanted, moving, or otherwise not right. A patient with hallucinations describes seeing objects that seem very real, though in fact they do not exist. Language disturbances. Rarely, a patient with a parietal seizure will report difficulty understanding spoken words or language, difficulty reading or performing simple math.